The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, smudged with coal dust and bearing the faint scent of whiskey and tobacco. Emma Thompson held it with trembling fingers as she read the words that would change her life forever. Robert Sullivan was dead, burned alive in the Silver Dollar Saloon fire that had consumed half of Cedar Falls just 3 days prior. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The man she was supposed to marry, the stranger who had promised her a new life in Colorado territory, was nothing but ash and memory now. But what the letter didn't mention, what nobody in that dusty mining town could have predicted, was that someone else had been watching her photograph on Robert's mantelpiece for months. Someone who had fallen desperately in love with a woman he'd never met. The year was 1882, and Cedar Falls was the kind of place where dreams came to die under the relentless Colorado sun. Built around a silver mine that had made a few men wealthy and left countless others broken, the town clung to the mountainside like a stubborn weed. The buildings were a patchwork of weathered wood and corrugated metal, their facades bleached white by the high-altitude sun and scoured clean by winds that carried the taste of alkali dust. Here, in this collection of ramshackle structures and grand ambitions, the social order was as rigid as the mountain rock beneath their feet, yet as fragile as the wooden structures that housed their hopes. Emma Thompson had never imagined she would find herself in such a place. Back in Philadelphia, she had been the daughter of a clockmaker, a respectable trade that had provided a modest but comfortable life, until her father's death left her with nothing but debts and the suffocating prospect of becoming a burden to distant relatives. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like Providence itself. Respectable gentleman seeks virtuous wife for life in Colorado territory. Must be of good character and willing to embrace frontier life. Serious inquiries only. The correspondence that followed had been proper and encouraging. Robert Sullivan had written of his successful mercantile business, his comfortable home, and his desire for a refined woman to share his prosperity. The journey west had been an ordeal of dust, discomfort, and mounting anxiety. Each mile that passed beneath the train wheels had carried Emma further from everything familiar and deeper into uncertainty. She had clutched Robert's photograph and his letters, reading them again and again, trying to convince herself that she was making the right choice. The man in the tintype had kind eyes and a confident smile, and his words spoke of genuine affection and respect. Yet as the landscape grew more barren and the towns more sparse, Emma felt the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders like the dust that coated everything in this harsh country. Cedar Falls had been a shock. The town was rougher than Robert's letters had suggested, a chaotic mixture of ambitious merchants, desperate miners, and the women who served them in various capacities. The respectable element that Robert had described in his correspondence was a thin veneer over a community that operated by its own harsh rules. The Silver Dollar Saloon dominated the main street, a two-story structure that served as the unofficial center of town life. It was there that business deals were struck, fortunes were won and lost, and men sought escape from the brutal realities of their daily existence. Emma had arrived on the afternoon stage, her trunk and valise marking her. As an outsider, as surely as if she had worn a sign. The driver had pointed toward the mercantile, where Robert was supposed to meet her. But as she approached the building, she noticed the absence of activity that should have marked a thriving business. The windows were shuttered, and a thin layer of dust on the door suggested it had been closed for some time. Confusion had given way to concern, and concern to a growing dread as she realized that something was terribly wrong. James Mitchell had been sweeping the front porch of his boarding house when he saw her standing there, a figure of obvious distress in her traveling dress and hat. He had watched her for several minutes, noting the way she kept glancing between the closed mercantile and the piece of paper in her hand. There was something about her bearing, the way she held herself with dignity despite her obvious confusion, that made him set aside his broom and cross the dusty street to offer assistance. The boarding house that James operated was one of the few establishments in Cedar Falls that catered to respectable travelers. Unlike the crude accommodations above the saloons and gambling halls, James maintained clean rooms with proper furnishings and served meals that wouldn't shame a city restaurant. He had inherited the business from his aunt, along with her insistence on maintaining standards that seemed almost quaint in a place like Cedar Falls. It was this commitment to respectability that had made him something of an outsider among the town's business community, a man who chose propriety over profit. When James approached Emma that first afternoon, he had no idea that she was the woman whose photograph had been displayed so prominently in Robert Sullivan's rooms above the mercantile. He had seen that image countless times during his visits to conduct business with Robert, and each glimpse had left him with a growing sense of longing he couldn't quite explain. The woman in the photograph had possessed an intelligence and refinement that seemed impossibly distant from his daily reality, yet her image had haunted his thoughts with increasing frequency. "Excuse me, miss," James had said, removing his hat as he approached. "You seem to be looking for someone. Perhaps I can be of assistance." Emma had turned to face him, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. The woman from Robert's photograph stood before him in flesh and blood, more beautiful and vital than any tintype could capture. Her eyes held a mixture of worry and determination that spoke of inner strength, and when she spoke, her voice carried the cultured tones he had imagined during his solitary moments of wondering. "I'm looking for Mr. Robert Sullivan," Emma had said, consulting the paper in her hand. "He was supposed to meet me at his mercantile, but the building appears to be closed. I'm Emma Thompson, and I've traveled from Philadelphia to meet him." The name hit James like a physical blow. This was Robert's intended bride, the woman who had been the subject of so much speculation and anticipation among the town's men. Robert had spoken of her arrival for weeks, describing her accomplishments and virtues with the pride of a man who had won a prize beyond his deserving. James had listened to these descriptions with a mixture of happiness for his friend and a growing ache in his chest that he couldn't name. "Miss Thompson," James had replied carefully, "I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share with you regarding Mr. Sullivan." The conversation that followed had been one of the most challenging of James's life. How do you tell a woman who has traveled across the country to marry a man that her intended husband is dead? How do you explain that? The fire which had consumed the Silver Dollar Saloon 3 nights earlier had also claimed the life of the man she had come to wed. James had chosen his words carefully, watching Emma's face pale as the reality of her situation became clear. The Silver Dollar Saloon fire had been the most devastating event in Cedar Falls' brief history. It had started just after midnight, on a Saturday, when the establishment was filled with miners celebrating their weekly payday. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The exact cause remained a mystery, but witnesses reported that the flames had spread with terrifying speed, fed by the alcohol-soaked wood floors and the generous quantities of liquor stored throughout the building. By the time the volunteer fire brigade could organize a response, the entire structure was engulfed in flames that reached toward the star-filled sky like the fingers of some desperate giant. Robert Sullivan had been among the casualties, trapped on the 2nd floor where he had been conducting a late-night poker game with several other businessmen. The stairs had been consumed by flames before anyone could reach them, and the windows were too high for a safe jump. 5 men had died that night. their bodies recovered only after the ruins had cooled enough for a proper search. The tragedy had shaken the entire community, not just for the loss of life, but for what it represented about the precarious nature of existence in a place like Cedar Falls. For Emma, the news had been devastating in ways that went beyond simple grief. She had not known Robert well enough to mourn him as a beloved, but his death represented the collapse of every plan she had made for her future. She was stranded in a strange town with limited resources and no clear path forward. The return journey to Philadelphia would consume most of her remaining money, and even if she could afford the trip, she had no prospects waiting for her there. The relatives who had made her feel unwelcome before her departure would hardly be pleased to see her return as a failed mail-order bride. James had offered her accommodation at his boarding house without hesitation, though he was careful to frame the gesture in terms of Christian charity and community responsibility. Emma had accepted with gratitude tempered by embarrassment, aware that her presence in the establishment of an unmarried man would inevitably become the subject of speculation and gossip. In a town where respectable women were scarce and the line between propriety and scandal was constantly patrolled by watchful eyes, every action was subject to interpretation and judgment. The boarding house itself reflected James's commitment to maintaining standards in an environment that often seemed to discourage such efforts. The rooms were simply but tastefully furnished, with clean linens and curtains that provided privacy without completely blocking the mountain light. The common areas were kept spotless, and James insisted on proper behavior from all his guests. It was a haven of respectability in a town where such refuges were rare and precious. Emma's arrival at the boarding house had created quite a stir among the other residents and the townspeople who took note of such things. Martha Wilson, who operated the general store and served as the unofficial keeper of Cedar Falls' social registry, had been particularly vocal in her observations about the propriety of the arrangement. A woman alone, even one with the tragic excuse of widowhood before marriage, living under the same roof as an unmarried man, was bound to generate talk, regardless of the circumstances that had created the situation. During those first difficult days, James had been a model of discretion and respectful behavior. He had arranged for Emma to take her meals in her room to avoid the scrutiny of the other boarders, and he had made sure that their interactions were brief and conducted in the presence of others whenever possible. Yet despite these precautions, he found himself thinking about her constantly, wondering about her thoughts and feelings as she grappled with her drastically altered circumstances. The tragedy of Robert's death had robbed Emma of more than just a husband. It had stolen her sense of purpose and direction. She spent hours staring out her window at the bustling activity of Cedar Falls' main street, watching the endless parade of miners, merchants, and travelers who seemed so certain of their destinations and desires. The town's rhythm was unlike anything she had experienced in Philadelphia, where life moved to the measured beat of factory whistles and church bells. Here, the pace was set by the demands of the mine, the whims of fortune, and the brutal realities of survival in an unforgiving landscape. The social structure of Cedar Falls was a complex web of relationships and obligations that Emma struggled to understand. The wealthy mine owners occupied the top tier, living in grand houses that seemed absurdly out of place in the rough mountain setting. Below them were the successful merchants and professional men, including the doctor, the lawyer, and the few other business owners who had managed to establish themselves. The miners formed the bulk of the population, ranging from independent prospectors with their own small claims to wage workers who descended into the earth each day for the promise of steady pay. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the transients and the women who served the town's less respectable needs, living in constant uncertainty and often desperate circumstances. James occupied an interesting position in this social structure. His boarding house provided him with a steady income and a certain respectability, but his refusal to engage in the more lucrative but morally questionable aspects of the local economy had limited his financial success. He could have made considerably more money by allowing gambling in his establishment or by turning a blind eye to other activities that would have compromised his standards. His choice to maintain his principles had earned him respect from some, quarters and puzzlement from others. The relationship between James and Robert had been one of mutual respect, despite their different approaches to business. Robert had been more willing to bend his principles when it served his financial interests, but he had genuinely admired James's commitment to his ideals. Their friendship had been based on shared experiences as men trying to build something, lasting in a temporary feeling place, and Robert's death had left James feeling unexpectedly isolated. As the days passed following Emma's arrival, James found himself struggling with emotions he hadn't expected to feel. The photograph in Robert's room had stirred something in him, but the reality of Emma's presence was far more powerful and complicated. He was drawn to her intelligence and resilience, the way she faced her difficult circumstances with dignity and determination. Yet he was also acutely aware of the impropriety of his feelings and the impossible nature of his situation. The town's reaction to Emma's presence had been mixed and telling. The men, particularly those who had known Robert, viewed her with a combination of sympathy and speculation. A beautiful, educated woman without a husband was both a tragedy and an opportunity, and James could see the calculations taking place behind their expressions of condolence. The women of Cedar Falls were more complex in their responses, torn between genuine sympathy for Emma's plight and concern about what her presence might mean for the town's carefully maintained social balance. Martha Wilson had been particularly pointed in her observations about the situation. During one of her visits to the boarding house, ostensibly to welcome Emma to the community, she had made several comments that barely concealed her disapproval of the arrangement. "It's such a shame about poor Mr. Sullivan," she had said, her eyes taking in every detail of Emma's appearance and deportment. "Such a respectable man, and so looking forward to married life. I'm sure you'll be wanting to return to your family back east as soon as arrangements can be made." The suggestion had been clear, and Emma had responded with polite firmness. "I haven't yet decided what my plans will be, Mrs. Wilson. I'm still coming to terms with this tragedy." Martha's smile had been tight and knowing. "Of course, dear. Though I'm sure you understand that a woman in your position needs to be particularly careful about appearances. People will talk, you know, and reputations are so fragile out here." After Martha's departure, James had found Emma sitting in the boarding house's small parlor, staring at her hands folded in her lap. The conversation with Martha had clearly shaken her, driving home the precarious nature of her social position. James had wanted to offer comfort and reassurance, but he was aware that his very presence was part of the problem that Martha had so delicately highlighted. "I apologize for Mrs. Wilson's comments," James had said carefully. "She means well, but she sometimes speaks more plainly than is comfortable." Emma had looked up at him with eyes that showed both vulnerability and strength. "She's not wrong about my situation, is she? I'm alone in a strange place, dependent on the kindness of people who don't really know me. My reputation is all I have left, and even that is being questioned." The honesty of her statement had pierced James's heart. He had wanted to tell her that her reputation was safe with him, that he would protect her from gossip and speculation, but such assurances would have been both presumptuous and potentially compromising. Instead, he had offered what practical comfort he could. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to sort out your circumstances," he had said, "and I'll do everything I can to ensure that your stay is comfortable and appropriate. Emma had thanked him with genuine gratitude, but James could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She was intelligent enough to understand that his kindness, however well-intentioned, was part of a situation that couldn't continue indefinitely without consequences for both of them. The economic realities of Emma's situation were becoming increasingly clear as the days passed. The money she had brought for her journey and new life was limited, and she had no immediate prospects for earning an income. The opportunities for respectable employment for women in Cedar Falls were extremely limited, essentially restricted to teaching, which required connections she didn't have, or taking in sewing and laundry, which would barely provide subsistence wages. The weight of these practical concerns was compounded by the emotional toll of her situation. Emma had not had time to grieve properly for the future she had lost, the life she had planned with a man she would now never know. The photograph of Robert that she had carried across the country seemed to mock her now, a reminder of dreams that had been reduced to ash in a matter of hours. James watched Emma struggle with these burdens and felt his own internal conflict intensify. Every instinct told him to offer more help, to find ways to ease her difficulties and provide her with the security she needed. Yet he was also aware that his growing feelings for her complicated any assistance he might offer. The line between Christian charity and personal interest was becoming increasingly blurred, and he knew that others in the community would not be hesitant to point out the distinction if they suspected his true motivations. The boarding house had become a kind of sanctuary for both of them, a place where they could interact with relative privacy while maintaining the appearance of propriety. Their conversations had grown longer and more personal as the days passed, revealing shared interests and values that made James's feelings for Emma even stronger. She had spoken of her love for books and learning, her dreams of teaching, and her desire to make a meaningful contribution to whatever community she found herself in. He had shared his own hopes for the boarding house and his commitment to providing a haven of respectability in a town that often seemed to lack such places. These conversations had taken place in the common areas of the boarding house, usually in the early evening when the other guests were either out or retired to their rooms. James had been careful to maintain appropriate distance and formality, but he found himself treasuring these moments of connection with Emma. Her intelligence and insight made her the most stimulating conversationalist he had encountered in years, and her presence had brought a richness to his daily routine that he hadn't realized was missing. Yet even as these interactions provided comfort and pleasure for both of them, they also highlighted the impossible nature of their situation. James was falling in love with a woman who was technically still mourning her intended husband, a woman whose social position was precarious enough without the additional complication of romantic involvement with her benefactor. Emma, for her part, seemed to find genuine pleasure in their conversations, but she was also clearly aware of the boundaries that propriety demanded they maintain. The tension between their growing connection and the constraints of their circumstances created an atmosphere of unspoken longing that permeated their interactions. They were two people who had found in each other exactly what they had been looking for, but at a time and in a situation that made acting on their feelings seem impossible. The tragedy that had brought them together had also created the barriers that kept them apart, and both of them felt the cruel irony of their situation. As Emma's first week in Cedar Falls drew to a close, the question of her future could no longer be postponed. She had written letters to her relatives in Philadelphia, but the responses would take weeks to arrive, and she already knew what they would likely contain. The boarding house arrangement, however comfortable and proper James tried to make it, could not continue indefinitely without seriously compromising both their reputations. The town's attention was beginning to focus more intently on the situation, with Martha Wilson serving as the unofficial spokesperson for those who believed that something needed to be done. Her visits to the boarding house had become more frequent and pointed, and her comments about the impropriety of the arrangement had grown more direct. Other members of the community had begun to echo her concerns, though some seemed motivated more by curiosity than genuine moral outrage. It was during this period of growing pressure that James began to realize that his feelings for Emma had moved far beyond mere attraction or sympathy. He was in love with her in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying, and the knowledge that she would likely leave Cedar Falls soon filled him with a desperation he had never experienced before. The thought of losing her just as he had found her seemed unbearable, yet he could see no honorable way to ask her to stay. Emma, meanwhile, was grappling with her own complex emotions. The kindness and respect that James had shown her had created feelings of gratitude that were beginning to shade into something deeper and more complicated. She found herself looking forward to their evening conversations with an anticipation that seemed to go beyond mere appreciation for companionship. His presence had become a source of comfort and stability in a world that had been turned upside down, and the thought of leaving him behind when she sorted out her future plans caused her unexpected pain. The situation came to a head on a particularly warm evening when the sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Emma and James were sitting on the boarding house's front porch, maintaining their usual careful distance while discussing a book they had both read. The conversation had been particularly animated, touching on themes of love, duty, and the choices people make when faced with impossible circumstances. As the light faded and the first stars appeared in the vast Colorado sky, Emma had grown quiet, staring out at the mountains that surrounded their small town. "I've been thinking about what I should do," she had said finally, her voice soft and uncertain. "I can't stay here indefinitely, and I can't continue to impose on your kindness." James had felt his heart stop at her words, even though he had been expecting them. "You're not imposing," he had replied carefully. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need to." Emma had turned to look at him then, and in the dim light from the boarding house windows, he could see the tears gathering in her eyes. "But what kind of life would that be?" she had asked. "For either of us? The whole town is talking, and they're not wrong to be concerned. A woman in my position can't afford to be the subject of gossip and speculation." The pain in her voice had been almost unbearable for James to hear. He had wanted to take her in his arms and tell her that he didn't care what anyone thought, that he would gladly face down the entire town if it meant she could stay. But such declarations would have been premature and potentially unwelcome, and he had forced himself to remain silent. The evening had ended with both of them retreating to their respective spaces, but not before James had made a decision that would change everything. He could no longer pretend that his feelings for Emma were merely those of a concerned benefactor, and he could no longer stand by and watch her struggle with an impossible situation when he had the power to offer her a solution. The risk of rejection and the potential complications were enormous, but the alternative of losing her seemed far worse. Tomorrow, he would find the courage to tell Emma the truth about his feelings and to offer her a choice that might seem as impossible as the circumstances that had brought them together. He would confess the secret love that had been growing in his heart since the first moment he had seen her photograph in Robert's room, and he would ask her to consider a future that neither of them had planned, but both of them might find they desperately wanted. James Mitchell had never been a man to act on impulse, but as dawn broke over the mountains surrounding Cedar Falls, he found himself pacing the length of his small office behind the boarding house kitchen, rehearsing words he wasn't sure he would have the courage to speak. The decision to reveal his feelings to Emma had seemed clear in the darkness of the previous night. But in the harsh light of morning, The magnitude of what he was contemplating filled him with equal measures of hope and terror. The boarding house was stirring to life around him as his regular guests prepared for another day of their various pursuits. He could hear the familiar sounds of boots on wooden floors, the splash of water in wash basins, and the quiet conversations that marked the beginning of each day. These routine noises, which had once provided him with a comforting sense of order and purpose, now seemed distant and unimportant compared to the turmoil in his heart. Emma had risen early as well, he knew, because he had seen the light beneath her door when he had passed through the hallway on his way to the kitchen. She had maintained the habits of an early riser since her arrival, perhaps finding in the quiet morning hours a refuge from the complexities of her situation. James had grown accustomed to preparing an extra pot of coffee for these solitary morning moments, though they had rarely shared them together, each maintaining the careful boundaries that propriety demanded. The decision he faced was complicated by more than just personal feelings. As a businessman in a small community, James understood that his reputation affected not only his own welfare, but the success of his establishment. The boarding house depended on the respect and patronage of Cedar Falls' more stable residents, and any scandal or impropriety could have serious financial consequences. Yet, as he considered these practical concerns, he found them increasingly insignificant compared to the possibility of losing Emma forever. His contemplation was interrupted by a knock at the kitchen door, followed by the entrance of Doc Peterson, one of his regular boarders and one of the few men in town whose opinion James truly valued. Doc was a man in his 50s who had come west after losing his wife and practice to yellow fever in New Orleans. He had established himself as Cedar Falls' physician not through necessity, but through a genuine desire to serve a community that desperately needed his skills. "Morning, James," Doc said, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot that was always kept warm on the stove. "You're up early, even for you." James nodded, grateful for the distraction from his own thoughts. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind, I suppose." Doc settled into one of the wooden chairs that surrounded the small table where James took his own meals. The doctor's presence was always calming, perhaps because he had seen so much of human nature in its various forms that little surprised or disturbed him anymore. His grey hair and lined face spoke of experience and wisdom, and his gentle manner had made him a trusted confidant to many in the community. "I imagine you do have a lot to think about," Doc said carefully. "The situation with Miss Thompson can't be easy for either of you." The direct mention of Emma's name caused James to look up sharply, wondering how much the doctor had observed or surmised about his feelings. Doc Peterson was known for his discretion, but he was also perceptive about human nature in ways that made him an excellent physician and a potentially uncomfortable observer. "She's in a difficult position," James replied cautiously. "I'm just trying to help her figure out what her options might be." Doc nodded slowly, sipping his coffee while studying James's face with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to reading unspoken truths. "She's a remarkable woman from what I can see, intelligent, well-educated, and handling a terrible situation with considerable grace. Robert Sullivan was a fortunate man, even if he didn't live to appreciate his good fortune." The mention of Robert's name brought a familiar pang of guilt to James's chest. Robert had been his friend, and the feelings he harbored for Emma felt like a betrayal of that friendship, even though Robert's death had occurred before James had even met her. The complexity of his emotions was something he struggled to understand himself, let alone explain to anyone else. "Robert spoke of her often in the weeks before his death," James said quietly. "He was very much looking forward to her arrival and to starting their life together. It's a tragedy in more ways than one." Doc leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Death has a way of changing the landscape of our lives in ways we never expect. Sometimes opportunities arise from tragedy that we never would have imagined or sought, but that doesn't make them any less real or valuable. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, and James wondered if the doctor was speaking generally or if he had divined the true nature of James's struggle. Doc Peterson had a way of offering guidance without seeming to give advice, allowing people to find their own answers while providing gentle nudges in helpful directions. The question, Doc continued, is whether we have the courage to recognize those opportunities and act on them when they present themselves. Fear of impropriety or social judgment can sometimes prevent us from pursuing genuine happiness and fulfillment. Before James could respond to this observation, they were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the stairs leading down from the guest rooms. Emma appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, dressed in one of her simple but elegant traveling dresses, her hair neatly arranged despite the early hour. She paused when she saw the two men, clearly uncertain whether she was intruding on a private conversation. "Good morning," she said politely. "I was hoping to get some coffee, but if you're having a private discussion, I can wait." "Not at all," Doc Peterson said, rising from his chair with the courtesy that marked him as a gentleman despite his frontier surroundings. "Please join us. I was just telling James how impressed I've been with the way you've handled such difficult circumstances." Emma accepted the compliment with a small smile, though James could see the shadows of worry and uncertainty in her eyes. She moved to the stove to pour herself coffee, and James found himself studying her graceful movements. The way the morning light from the window highlighted the auburn tones in her dark hair, the quiet dignity she maintained even in her current precarious situation. "You're very kind, Dr. Peterson," Emma replied. "I'm afraid I don't feel nearly as composed as I might appear. Everything about my situation seems uncertain right now." Doc nodded sympathetically. "Uncertainty can be frightening, but it can also be liberating. When all our carefully laid plans are disrupted, we sometimes discover possibilities we never would have considered otherwise." Emma glanced at James as she took a seat at the table, and he felt the familiar flutter in his chest that her presence always inspired. The three of them sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, each lost in their own thoughts, while the sounds of the awakening town filtered through the windows. "I've been thinking about what I might do to support myself," Emma said eventually. "I can't continue to impose on Mr. Mitchell's generosity indefinitely, and I need to find some way to make a living if I'm going to stay in Cedar Falls." The mention of her potential departure sent a jolt of panic through James, though he tried to keep his expression neutral. The possibility that she might leave had been haunting him for days, but hearing her speak of it so matter-of-factly made it seem suddenly immediate and real. "There aren't many opportunities for women in a town like this," Doc said gently. "Teaching would be the most obvious choice, but the school board is particular about their requirements, and they prefer candidates with local references." Emma nodded, clearly having considered this already. "I've thought about taking in sewing or laundry, but I'm not sure that would provide enough income to live independently." James felt his heart racing as he realized that this conversation was providing him with the opening he had been seeking. The practical discussion of Emma's future was the perfect context for him to reveal his feelings and make his proposal. Yet the words seemed to stick in his throat as he contemplated the magnitude of what he was about to risk. "There might be another option," he said finally, his voice sounding strange and uncertain to his own ears. "Something we haven't discussed yet." Both Emma and Doc turned to look at him, and James felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. This was the moment he had been preparing for, yet now that it had arrived, he found himself struggling to find the right words to express feelings that seemed too large and complex for ordinary language. "I'm not sure this is the right time or place," he continued, glancing at Doc Peterson, "but I can't continue to pretend that my feelings about this situation are purely those of a concerned friend and neighbor." Emma's eyes widened slightly, and James could see a mixture of surprise and something else, perhaps hope in her expression. Doc Peterson remained silent, but his presence felt supportive rather than intrusive, as if he understood the significance of what was happening and wanted to provide whatever assistance he could through his mere witness to the moment. "The truth is," James continued, his voice growing stronger as he committed himself to honesty, "I've been in love with you since before we ever met. Robert had your photograph displayed in his rooms above the mercantile, and every time I visited him on business, I found myself drawn to that image. I told myself it was simply appreciation for a beautiful woman. But as the weeks passed, I began to realize that my feelings went much deeper than that." Emma's hand moved to her throat in a gesture of surprise, and James could see that she was struggling to process this unexpected revelation. The silence that followed his confession seemed to stretch endlessly, and he began to fear that he had made a terrible mistake in revealing his feelings so directly. "I know this is sudden and probably unwelcome," he continued, desperate to fill the silence before it became unbearable. "I know you came here to marry Robert, and I know you're still dealing with the shock of his death. But I also know that I can't stand by and watch you leave Cedar Falls without telling you how I feel and asking if there might be a chance for us to build something together." Doc Peterson cleared his throat gently, drawing their attention back to his presence. "Perhaps I should leave you two to discuss this privately," he said, beginning to rise from his chair. "No, please stay," Emma said quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think I need a moment to understand what's happening here." She looked directly at James for the first time since his confession, and he could see the conflict in her eyes as she struggled to reconcile this new information with everything she thought she knew about their relationship. The careful boundaries they had maintained, the formal politeness that had characterized their interactions, suddenly seemed like elaborate performances designed to hide truths that had been obvious to everyone but themselves. "You're telling me that you've had feelings for me since before we met?" she asked, her voice gaining strength as she worked through the implications. "That all this time, while I've been thinking of you as a kind benefactor helping a stranger in distress, you've been... what? Courting me?" James felt heat rise in his cheeks at the direct question, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact as he answered. "I've been trying to be respectful of your situation and your grief. I never intended to take advantage of your vulnerability or to pursue my own interests while you were dealing with such a difficult loss. But yes, my feelings for you have influenced every interaction we've had." Emma stood abruptly and moved to the window, staring out at the bustling main street of Cedar Falls as if seeing it for the first time. James watched her silhouette against the morning light, noting the tension in her shoulders and the way her hands clasped and unclasped as she processed his revelation. "This changes everything," she said finally, without turning around. "All those conversations we've had, all those moments when I thought I was developing inappropriate feelings for the man who was helping me in my time of need. You're telling me that those feelings weren't inappropriate at all, that they were actually mutual." The hope in her voice was unmistakable, and James felt his heart leap with the possibility that his confession might not result in rejection after all. He stood as well, moving closer to her, but stopping short of actually touching her, aware that Doc Peterson was still present and that propriety still mattered, even in the midst of such an emotionally charged moment. "I can't speak for your feelings," James said carefully, "but if you're saying that you felt something more than gratitude for my assistance, then yes, those feelings have been entirely mutual. I've been fighting against my attraction to you every day since you arrived, telling myself that it was wrong to have such thoughts about a woman who was mourning her intended husband." Emma turned to face him then, and James could see tears gathering in her eyes, though whether they were tears of relief, joy, or continued confusion, he couldn't tell. The emotional weight of the past week seemed to be settling on her shoulders as she realized that the careful balance she had been trying to maintain was built on assumptions that were no longer valid. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I came here to marry a man I'd never met, prepared to build a life with a stranger based on letters and a photograph. That man is dead, and now you're telling me that the man who saved me from complete destitution has been in love with me all along. How am I supposed to make sense of any of this?" Doc Peterson spoke up from his position at the table, his voice gentle but firm. "Perhaps the question isn't how to make sense of it, but what you want to do about it. Life rarely follows the plans we make, and sometimes the most important decisions we face are the ones we never expected to have to make." Emma looked between the two men, clearly struggling with the complexity of her emotions and the practical implications of James's confession. The boarding house kitchen, which had been a refuge of quiet normalcy for both of them, had suddenly become the stage for a drama that would determine the course of both their lives. "If I were to consider this," Emma said slowly, "if I were to entertain the possibility of staying in Cedar Falls and exploring whatever these feelings might lead to, what would that look like? What would people say about a woman who came here to marry one man and ended up with another before the first man was even properly buried?" James felt a surge of hope at her words, even as he recognized the legitimate concern she was raising. The social implications of their situation were significant, and in a small town like Cedar Falls, public opinion could make the difference between acceptance and ostracism. "People will talk," he admitted honestly. "Martha Wilson and others like her will have plenty to say about the impropriety of the situation. But I think there are also people in this community who understand that tragedy sometimes creates unexpected opportunities for happiness, and who would support our right to find comfort and love in the midst of difficult circumstances." Doc Peterson nodded his agreement. "From a medical perspective, I can tell you that grief and healing take many forms, and sometimes the best cure for loss is the discovery of new possibilities for joy. There's nothing shameful about finding love in the aftermath of tragedy, especially when that love offers both parties a chance for genuine happiness and fulfillment." Emma moved back to the table and sat down heavily, as if the weight of the decision she faced was too much to bear while standing. James resumed his own seat, careful to maintain some distance while still being close enough to continue their conversation in low voices that wouldn't carry to other parts of the boarding house. "There's something else we need to consider," Emma said, her voice taking on a practical tone that James recognized as her way of dealing with overwhelming emotions by focusing on concrete details. "If we were to pursue this, if we were to allow our feelings to develop into something more formal, what would be the timeline? How long would be considered appropriate to wait before making any kind of public announcement or commitment?" The question revealed the depth of Emma's consideration of his proposal, and James felt a wave of gratitude that she was taking his confession seriously rather than dismissing it out of hand. Her practical approach to the emotional situation was one of the qualities that had drawn him to her in the first place, and he appreciated her ability to think clearly even in the midst of such a charged moment. "I think," James said carefully, "that the timeline would need to be determined by what feels right to both of us, balanced against what the community would consider appropriate. Robert's death was sudden and tragic, but you never actually knew him as more than a correspondent. Your grief is real, but it's different from the grief of a widow who has lost a beloved husband." Doc Peterson leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "In my experience, there are no universal rules for matters of the heart. Some people require years to recover from loss, while others find that new love helps them heal more quickly than solitude ever could. The key is honesty about your own feelings and respect for the memory of the departed. Emma nodded slowly, clearly weighing these perspectives against her own instincts and values. The morning sun had climbed higher during their conversation, and the sounds from the street suggested that Cedar Falls was fully awake and engaged in its daily business. Soon, other boarders would be coming down for breakfast, and the private nature of their discussion would necessarily come to an end. "I need time to think about this," Emma said finally. "This conversation has changed everything I thought I understood about my situation, and I can't make such an important decision without careful consideration of all the implications." James felt a mixture of disappointment and relief at her response. Part of him had hoped for an immediate answer, some sign that his feelings were so clearly reciprocated that no deliberation would be necessary. But the rational part of his mind recognized that Emma's caution was appropriate and even admirable, given the complexity of their circumstances. "Of course," he said, "take all the time you need. Nothing about this situation requires an immediate decision, and I would never want you to feel pressured into anything that doesn't feel completely right to you." Doc Peterson finished his coffee and stood, clearly recognizing that his presence was no longer needed for this particular conversation. "I'll leave you two to continue this discussion in private," he said. "But I will say that in my years of practice, I've learned to recognize genuine affection when I see it, and I believe you both deserve whatever happiness you might find together." After Doc had left, Emma and James sat in companionable silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts about the conversation that had just transformed their relationship. The familiar sounds of the boarding house morning routine continued around them, but everything felt different now that the truth had been spoken between them. "Can I ask you something?" Emma said eventually. "Of course. When you saw Robert's photograph of me, what did you think? What was it that made you feel whatever it was you felt?" James considered the question carefully, wanting to give her an honest answer that would help her understand the depth and nature of his feelings. "At first, it was simply that you were beautiful, but not in the way that might make a man think improper thoughts about another man's intended bride. There was something in your expression, in the way you held yourself, even in a formal photograph, that suggested intelligence and character. You looked like someone who thought deeply about things, someone who would have interesting conversations and thoughtful opinions." Emma smiled slightly at this description. "And now that you've actually met me and spent time with me, do I live up to whatever impression you formed from that photograph? Do you exceed it in every way?" James said without hesitation. "The photograph showed me a beautiful and intelligent-looking woman, but it couldn't capture your kindness, your resilience, your sense of humor, or the way you make even the most ordinary conversation feel important and engaging. It couldn't show me how gracefully you handle difficult situations or how much strength you have beneath that gentle exterior." Emma's cheeks colored slightly at his praise, but she didn't look away from his gaze. "I have to admit that I've been fighting feelings of my own," she said quietly. "I kept telling myself that what I felt was just gratitude mixed with the natural relief of finding safety after such a frightening experience. But there were moments, during our conversations especially, when I found myself wishing that circumstances were different, that we had met under conditions that would allow me to explore whatever connection I felt developing between us." The admission sent a thrill through James that he tried to keep from showing too obviously in his expression. Her words confirmed what he had hoped, but hadn't dared to assume, that the attraction and growing affection he felt were at least partially reciprocated. "What kind of different circumstances did you imagine?" he asked gently. Emma was quiet for a moment, clearly considering how much to reveal. I imagined meeting you in a normal way, perhaps being introduced by mutual friends or meeting at a social gathering. I imagined having the opportunity to get to know you without the complications of my situation with Robert, without the questions about propriety and reputation that seem to shadow every interaction we have. James nodded his understanding. And if those had been the circumstances, if we had met in some ordinary way, without all these complications, what do you think might have developed between us? Emma met his eyes directly for the first time since his confession, and James could see both vulnerability and hope in her expression. I think, she said slowly, that I would have been very interested in getting to know you better. I think I would have looked forward to our conversations and found excuses to spend time in your company. I think I might have found myself falling in love with you without any of the guilt and confusion that seems to accompany every feeling I have now. The words hung between them like a bridge spanning the gap that had separated them since her arrival in Cedar Falls. James felt a sense of relief and joy that was almost overwhelming, tempered by the recognition that admitting their mutual attraction was only the first step in navigating the complex path toward whatever future they might build together. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of other boarders beginning to stir upstairs, signaling that their private moment was coming to an end. Emma glanced toward the ceiling as footsteps moved across the floor above them, and James could see her shifting back into the careful composure she had maintained throughout her stay at the boarding house. We should probably continue this conversation later, she said, though her tone suggested reluctance to end this moment of honesty and connection. When we can have more privacy and time to really think through all the implications. James agreed, though he felt the same reluctance to return to the careful boundaries they had maintained before this morning's revelations. The knowledge that his feelings were reciprocated had changed everything between them, even if they couldn't yet act on that knowledge in any public way. As they prepared to return to their respective roles as boarding house keeper and guest, James made a decision that surprised him with its boldness. Emma, he said, reaching out to briefly touch her hand as she rose from the table. Whatever you decide about us, about your future, I want you to know that this conversation has been the most important one of my life. Whatever happens next, I'm grateful that I finally had the courage to tell you the truth. Emma's smile in response was the most genuine and unguarded expression he had seen from her since her arrival, and it filled him with hope that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together rather than as strangers bound only by circumstance and propriety. The news reached Cedar Falls on a Wednesday afternoon, carried by the stagecoach driver who had overheard conversations at the last way station. A federal marshal was coming to investigate the Silver Dollar Saloon fire, and with him would come questions that could unravel more than just the mystery of how the blaze had started. Word spread through the town like wildfire itself, reaching every corner of the community before the sun had set on the dusty main street. James heard the news from Sheriff Hayes, who had stopped by the boarding house ostensibly to check on Emma's welfare, but actually to warn James about the potential complications that a federal investigation might bring. The sheriff was a practical man who understood the delicate balance of relationships and secrets that kept a frontier town functioning, and he had concerns about what outside scrutiny might reveal. The thing is, Sheriff Hayes said, settling his considerable bulk into one of the chairs in James's small office, a federal marshal isn't going to be satisfied with our local investigation. He's going to want to interview everyone who knew the victims, everyone who was in the saloon that night, and everyone who might have had business dealings with the men who died. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air filtering through the open window. What does that have to do with Emma? The sheriff's expression was carefully neutral, but James could see the concern beneath his professional demeanor. Miss Thompson was supposed to marry Robert Sullivan. She's his next of kin, legally speaking, which means she might inherit his property and debts. A federal marshal is going to want to know about her relationship with Robert, her reasons for coming to Cedar Falls, and her whereabouts during the fire. The implications hit James like a physical blow. Emma had been in his boarding house on the night of the fire, alone with him except for the other guests who had been sleeping. While their relationship had been entirely proper at that time, the appearance of impropriety could be devastating under federal scrutiny, especially given the revelations of the morning's conversation. Surely no one would suggest that Emma had anything to do with the fire, James said, though even as he spoke the words, he could imagine how their situation might look to an outsider. A mail-order bride arrives in town, her intended husband dies in a convenient fire, and she immediately takes up residence with another man who had been harboring secret feelings for her. Sheriff Hayes leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "I'm not suggesting anything of the sort, and neither is anyone else in town who knows Miss Thompson. But a federal marshal doesn't know her character, and he's going to be looking for motives and opportunities. The timing of her arrival, combined with her current living situation, could raise questions that might be difficult to answer satisfactorily." James stood and moved to the window, staring out at the street where life continued with its normal rhythm, unaware of the storm that might be approaching. The revelation of his feelings to Emma that morning had felt like the beginning of something hopeful and beautiful. But now it seemed that external forces were conspiring to complicate their situation before they had even had a chance to explore what their mutual attraction might lead to. "What do you suggest we do?" James asked finally. "I think," the sheriff said carefully, "that you and Miss Thompson need to have a serious conversation about how you want to handle the marshal's questions. If there's any chance that your relationship might become public knowledge as a result of this investigation, you need to be prepared for that possibility." After the sheriff left, James sat alone in his office, trying to process the implications of this new development. The federal investigation would bring a level of scrutiny to Cedar Falls that the town had never experienced, and the comfortable arrangements and quiet understandings that governed daily life would be subject to outside judgment. His confession to Emma, which had felt so natural and right that morning, now seemed like a complication that could destroy both their reputations. He found Emma in the boarding house parlor, reading a book that she had borrowed from his small collection. She looked up as he entered, and he could see in her expression that she had already heard about the coming investigation. News traveled fast in a small town, and the implications would not have been lost on someone with her intelligence and awareness of social dynamics. "I suppose you've heard about the federal marshal," she said, closing the book and setting it aside. James nodded, taking a seat across from her in one of the comfortable chairs that made the parlor a pleasant refuge from the harsh realities of frontier life. Sheriff Hayes came by to discuss the situation. He's concerned about how the investigation might affect you given your connection to Robert. Emma's laugh was bitter and without humor. "My connection to Robert. A man I never met, whose letters I carried across the country, whose photograph I studied for months, trying to imagine what our life together might be like. And now that connection might be used to suggest that I somehow benefited from his death." The pain in her voice was evident, and James felt a surge of protective anger toward anyone who might question her character or motives. Emma had suffered enough already without having to defend herself against baseless suspicions, and the thought of her being subjected to hostile questioning by a federal marshal filled him with fury. "No one who knows you would believe such a thing," James said firmly. You've conducted yourself with complete propriety since your arrival, and your character is evident to anyone who spends 5 minutes in your company." Emma shook her head, her expression troubled. "But the marshal doesn't know me, does he? All he'll see is a woman who came here to marry a man for his money, found him conveniently dead, and immediately took up residence with another man." From the outside, it might look like a very calculated series of events. James had to admit that she was right about how their situation might appear to an outsider, especially one predisposed to look for suspicious circumstances. The timing of Emma's arrival, the nature of her relationship with Robert, and her current living arrangement created a pattern that could be interpreted in ways that had nothing to do with the actual truth of their circumstances. "There's something else we need to consider," Emma continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, even though they were alone in the parlor. "This morning's conversation between us. If the marshal interviews people in town, if he asks questions about our relationship, what are we going to say?" The question struck at the heart of James's concerns. Their mutual confession of feelings had created a new reality between them, but it was a reality that could be devastating if it became public knowledge before they had time to handle it properly. The suggestion that James had been in love with Emma before Robert's death could be twisted into evidence of motive for some kind of conspiracy. "We tell the truth," James said, though even as he spoke the words, he realized how complicated the truth had become. "You came here to marry Robert, found him dead, and I offered you accommodation out of Christian charity. Our feelings for each other developed naturally over time, as such feelings often do when two compatible people spend time together." Emma considered this approach, but James could see the doubt in her expression. "And if he asks when these feelings began? If he discovers somehow that you had seen my photograph before we met? If someone mentions that you used to visit Robert's rooms above the Mercantile?" These were the questions that James had been trying not to think about, the complications that could transform an innocent attraction into something that sounded calculated and predatory. The truth was that his feelings for Emma had begun before they met, sparked by her photograph and nurtured by his imagination during the weeks leading up to her arrival. To an outsider, this could look like the foundation for an elaborate scheme. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Martha Wilson, who entered the parlor without ceremony, as was her habit when she felt that community concerns gave her the right to involve herself in private matters. Her expression was a mixture of excitement and disapproval, the look of someone who had juicy gossip to share but wanted to maintain the appearance of moral outrage. "I suppose you've heard about the federal marshal," Martha said, settling herself into one of the chairs without being invited to sit. "Such an exciting development for our little town, though I'm sure it will be quite stressful for some people." Her eyes moved meaningfully between James and Emma, making it clear that she considered them to be among those who might find the federal investigation stressful. Martha had always been suspicious of their living arrangement, and the prospect of outside scrutiny clearly pleased her sense of moral righteousness. "I imagine the marshal will want to interview everyone who knew poor Mr. Sullivan," Martha continued, her voice taking on the false sympathy that she employed when discussing other people's misfortunes. "It must be so difficult for you, Miss Thompson, to have your personal affairs subjected to federal investigation." Emma's response was polite but cool. "I have nothing to hide, Mrs. Wilson. I came here in good faith to marry Mr. Sullivan, and his death was as much a shock to me as it was to everyone else in the community." Martha's smile was sharp and knowing. "Of course, dear, though I'm sure the marshal will be interested in how quickly you've adapted to life in Cedar Falls. It's remarkable how resilient young women can be when they find themselves in unexpected circumstances." James felt his temper rising at Martha's barely concealed implications, But before he could respond, Emma spoke with a dignity that made Martha's petty insinuations seem even more obvious and unpleasant. "I've been fortunate to find kindness and assistance during a very difficult time," Emma said evenly. "Mr. Mitchell's generosity in providing me with respectable accommodation has been a blessing, and I'm grateful for the Christian charity shown by the people of this community." Martha's expression suggested that she had more to say on the subject, but the arrival of other boarders returning from their daily activities prevented her from continuing her pointed observations. She left shortly afterward, but not before making it clear that she would be very interested in whatever revelations the federal investigation might produce. After Martha's departure, James and Emma sat in troubled silence, both recognizing that their conversation had been a preview of the kind of scrutiny they could expect once the marshal arrived. Martha Wilson's suspicions were shared by others in the community, and the federal investigation would provide those suspicions with an official forum that could be far more damaging than local gossip. "We need to make a decision," Emma said finally. "We can continue as we have been, maintaining the fiction that our relationship is purely that of landlord and guest, and hope that the investigation doesn't reveal anything that contradicts that story. Or we can be proactive about controlling the narrative." James looked at her questioningly, not sure what she meant by being proactive. "We could announce our engagement," Emma said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was suggesting. "If we're publicly committed to each other, then any feelings that existed before Robert's death become irrelevant. A tragic situation led to our meeting, and love grew naturally from proximity and mutual respect." The suggestion took James's breath away. That morning, he had confessed his feelings and hoped for some indication that Emma might consider a future with him. Now, less than 12 hours later, she was proposing that they formalize their relationship as a matter of practical necessity. "Are you sure about this?" James asked. "Marriage is a serious commitment, and entering into it primarily to protect ourselves from scandal seems like it might create problems of its own." Emma stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the street where the shadows were growing longer as evening approached. "This morning, you told me that you'd been in love with me since before we met. I told you that I'd been fighting feelings of my own, feelings that went beyond gratitude for your kindness. If we both believe that we could build a happy life together, then perhaps the timing of our engagement is less important than the sincerity of our commitment to each other." James joined her at the window, standing close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, but still maintaining the careful distance that propriety demanded. "And if the investigation reveals that I had seen your photograph before we met? If it comes out that I had feelings for you before Robert's death?" Emma turned to face him, and James was struck by the strength and determination in her expression. "Then we tell the truth, that you saw a photograph and were intrigued by what you saw, but that you never acted on those feelings while Robert was alive. That you were a gentleman who respected another man's claim, and that our relationship only began after circumstances made it possible." The logic of her argument was compelling, but James still felt overwhelmed by the speed with which their situation was evolving. That morning, he had been a man harboring secret feelings for a woman who might leave town at any moment. Now he was contemplating a public engagement that would tie their fates together permanently. "There's another consideration," Emma continued. "If we're engaged, I would have a legitimate reason to remain in Cedar Falls, and you would have a legitimate reason to provide for my welfare. Our living arrangement becomes appropriate rather than scandalous, and any feelings we might have for each other become natural rather than improper." James could see the wisdom in her reasoning, but he also wanted to be sure that she was choosing him for the right reasons. Emma, I don't want you to feel that you have to marry me to protect yourself from scandal or to secure your future. If that's your primary motivation, then we should find another solution." Emma reached out and took his hand, the first time she had initiated such contact since her arrival in Cedar Falls. Her touch sent electricity through his entire body, and he realized that whatever practical considerations might be driving her suggestion, the connection between them was genuine and powerful. "My primary motivation," she said softly, "is that I've fallen in love with you. Everything else is just practical details that we need to manage so that we can have a chance to build the life together that we both want." The words were everything James had hoped to hear, but never dared to expect. Emma's declaration of love, spoken with such quiet certainty, made all the complications and challenges seem manageable in comparison to the joy of knowing that his feelings were truly reciprocated. "In that case," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "I would be honored to marry you, Emma Thompson, not because of the federal marshal or the gossip or the practical considerations, but because I love you and I want to spend my life making you happy." Emma's smile in response was radiant, transforming her entire face and making James feel as though the sun had come out after a long winter. They stood there for a moment, hands clasped and eyes locked, both recognizing that they had just made a commitment that would change both their lives forever. The sound of footsteps on the front porch broke the spell, reminding them that they were still in the parlor of a boarding house where privacy was limited and appearances mattered. They stepped apart, but the connection between them remained palpable, and James knew that everything had changed between them in the space of a few words. Doc Peterson appeared in the doorway, his medical bag in hand, and his expression suggesting that he had spent the afternoon dealing with some minor emergency or routine call. He took in the scene before him with the perceptive eye of someone who had spent years reading human nature, and James suspected that their recent conversation was written clearly on both their faces. "Good evening," Doc said pleasantly. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." James and Emma exchanged a glance, and James made a decision that surprised him with its boldness. "Actually, Doc, your timing is perfect. Emma has just agreed to marry me, and I was hoping you might be willing to serve as a witness when we make the announcement to the community." Doc Peterson's face broke into a genuine smile, the first completely unguarded expression James had seen from him since the morning's conversation in the kitchen. "I would be delighted to serve as witness," he said warmly, "though I have to say I'm not entirely surprised by this development. It was clear to me this morning that you two had found something special in each other." Emma blushed at Doc's observation, but she didn't deny it. "We've decided not to wait for a long courtship," she said. "Given the circumstances surrounding my arrival in Cedar Falls and the upcoming federal investigation, it seems best to make our intentions clear as soon as possible." Doc nodded his understanding. "A wise decision, I think. Love doesn't always arrive on a convenient schedule, and there's no point in letting social conventions prevent two people from claiming the happiness they've found together." As they discussed the practical details of announcing their engagement, James felt a sense of anticipation and nervousness that was entirely different from the anxiety he had been feeling about the federal investigation. Emma was going to be his wife, and they were going to build a life together based on genuine love and mutual respect. Whatever challenges the marshal's investigation might bring, they would face them as partners rather than as individuals struggling to maintain an impossible fiction. The engagement announcement would need to be handled carefully to minimize scandal and maximize the appearance of propriety. They decided that James would speak to Reverend Carter first, explaining the situation and asking for his support in presenting their relationship to the community in the most favorable light possible. The Reverend was a practical man who understood the realities of frontier life, and his endorsement would carry significant weight with the more respectable elements of Cedar Falls society. Emma would write to her relatives in Philadelphia, informing them of her change in circumstances and her decision to remain in Colorado Territory. The letter would be difficult to compose, requiring her to explain how she had gone from planning to marry one man to becoming engaged to another in the space of a few days. But James was confident that her natural eloquence would allow her to present the situation in a way that emphasized the genuine nature of their feelings rather than the suddenness of their decision. As evening settled over Cedar Falls, James and Emma found themselves planning a future together that neither of them had imagined when the day began. The federal investigation still loomed as a potential source of complications, but the knowledge that they would face whatever came as an engaged couple rather than as individuals with something to hide made all the challenges seem more manageable. The boarding house settled into its evening quiet around them, with the other guests retiring to their rooms and the sounds of the town gradually diminishing as businesses closed and families gathered for their evening meals. James and Emma remained in the parlor, talking quietly about their plans and their hopes, both marveling at how quickly their lives had been transformed by the simple act of speaking the truth about their feelings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new complications, but tonight they were simply two people who had found love in the most unexpected circumstances and were brave enough to claim the happiness that fate had offered them. The federal marshal could ask his questions and the townspeople could offer their opinions, but nothing could change the fundamental truth that James Mitchell and Emma Thompson had found in each other exactly what they had been searching for all their lives. The federal marshal arrived on the Thursday morning stage, a tall man with steel-gray eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Marshal Henry Blackwood stepped down from the coach with the measured movements of a predator surveying new territory, his gaze taking in every detail of Cedar Falls' main street as if cataloging potential evidence. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little, and his presence immediately changed the atmosphere of the entire town. Word of the marshal's arrival spread through Cedar Falls, faster than smoke from a chimney fire. Shopkeepers found excuses to step outside their establishments, miners delayed their descent into the earth, and housewives discovered urgent errands that required them to walk past the hotel where the federal man had taken up residence. Even the saloon girls from the establishments that had survived the fire found reasons to peer around corners and whisper among themselves about what this official scrutiny might mean for their particular form of commerce. James felt his stomach tighten as he watched the marshal's arrival from the window of his boarding house office. Emma stood beside him, her face pale but composed, and he could feel the tension radiating from her slender frame. They had spent the previous evening discussing their strategy for handling whatever questions might come, but the reality of facing a federal investigation was far more daunting than their careful preparations had suggested. The announcement of their engagement had been made the previous evening at a hastily organized gathering in the boarding house parlor. Reverend Carter had agreed to be present, lending his moral authority to the proceedings, and Doc Peterson had served as their primary witness. The small group of respected townspeople who had been invited to hear the news had received it with varying degrees of surprise, approval, and skepticism, but none had been bold enough to voice direct objections in the presence of the Reverend. Martha Wilson had been conspicuously absent from the announcement gathering, though James was certain that she had learned of the engagement within hours of its being made public. Her reaction, when it came, would undoubtedly be pointed and unforgiving, but at least now their relationship had the protection of social respectability. however hastily constructed that respectability might be. "He looks like a man who doesn't miss much," Emma observed quietly, watching as Marshal Blackwood engaged Sheriff Hayes in what appeared to be an intense conversation outside the hotel. James nodded grimly. Everything about the Marshal's demeanor suggested a methodical and thorough investigator, someone who would not be satisfied with surface explanations or local assurances. The comfortable assumptions and gentle conspiracies of silence that governed life in Cedar Falls would mean nothing to a federal officer whose job was to uncover truth, regardless of how inconvenient or uncomfortable that truth might be. "We should probably expect to be summoned for questioning today," James said. "The Marshal will want to establish a timeline of events, and Emma's connection to Robert makes her a key witness, whether she knew him personally or not." Emma straightened her shoulders in a gesture that James had come to recognize as her way of preparing herself for challenges. "Then we'll answer his questions honestly and hope that the truth is sufficient to satisfy his investigation." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the boarding house front door, followed by the entrance of Sheriff Hayes, whose expression suggested that the conversation with the federal marshal had not been entirely pleasant. The sheriff's usual easy confidence had been replaced by the careful wariness of a local official who suddenly found himself accountable to higher authorities. "The marshal wants to see both of you this afternoon," Sheriff Hayes announced without preamble. 2 o'clock at the hotel. He's set up a kind of temporary office in the dining room, and he'll be conducting formal interviews with anyone who had connections to the victims or knowledge of events surrounding the fire. James felt Emma's hand briefly touch his arm, a gesture of support that gave him strength, even as it reminded him of how much they both had to lose if the investigation went badly. "Did he say what kinds of questions he'll be asking?" Sheriff Hayes shook his head. "Marshal Blackwood is not the kind of man who shares his investigative strategies with local law enforcement, but I get the impression that he's looking for inconsistencies, unexplained circumstances, and possible motives for arson or murder." The word murder hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming what had been a tragic accident into something far more sinister and complex. James had assumed that the federal investigation was primarily concerned with determining whether the fire had been deliberately set, but the possibility that someone had intentionally killed Robert and the other victims added an entirely new dimension to their situation. "Murder," Emma repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "But surely the fire was accidental. These buildings are all wood and metal, and accidents happen all the time in mining towns." Sheriff Hayes's expression was troubled. "That's what we all assumed. But apparently there are some aspects of the fire that have raised questions in Denver. The pattern of how it spread, the fact that it seemed to start in multiple locations simultaneously, and some other technical details that I don't fully understand myself." After the sheriff left, James and Emma spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, trying to maintain their normal routines while preparing mentally for an interview that could determine their future in Cedar Falls, and possibly much more. The other boarders seemed to sense the tension in the house, conducting their own daily business with unusual quiet and avoiding prolonged conversations that might add to the general atmosphere of unease. Doc Peterson stopped by during his morning rounds, ostensibly to check on a minor injury that one of the guests had sustained, but actually to offer support and encouragement to James and Emma. His presence was calming, and his practical advice about how to handle official questioning proved invaluable. "The key," Doc explained, "is to answer only what is asked, to be truthful but not expansive, and to avoid speculation or volunteering information that hasn't been requested. Federal marshals are trained to look for inconsistencies and nervous behavior, so the best approach is to remain calm and stick to facts that you know to be true." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "What about our engagement?" Should we mention it if he doesn't ask directly? Doc considered the question carefully. I think that depends on the context of his questions. If he's asking about your current circumstances or your plans for remaining in Cedar Falls, then it would be natural to mention your engagement. But if he's focused purely on events surrounding Robert's death, then it might seem suspicious to bring up your romantic relationship with James without being prompted. The advice was sound, but it highlighted the delicate balance they would need to maintain during the interview. Too little information might make them seem evasive, while too much might raise questions about the timing and nature of their relationship. As 2 o'clock approached, James and Emma made their way to the hotel, both dressed in their most respectable attire and both trying to project an air of calm confidence that neither of them truly felt. The hotel dining room had been transformed into a makeshift interrogation chamber, with Marshal Blackwood seated behind a large table that served as his desk, and 2 chairs positioned across from him for the people he would be questioning. The Marshal himself was an imposing figure up close, with penetrating grey eyes and a face that revealed nothing of his thoughts or intentions. He wore a well-tailored suit that spoke of federal authority and resources, and his manner was polite but utterly professional. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions and evaluating the answers for truth and deception. "Miss Thompson," Marshal Blackwood began, consulting a notebook filled with what appeared to be extensive notes. "I understand that you traveled from Philadelphia to marry Mr. Robert Sullivan, arriving in Cedar Falls just days after his death in the saloon fire. That must have been quite a shock." Emma's reply was steady and clear. "Yes, Marshal. I had been corresponding with Mr. Sullivan for several months, and we had arranged for me to travel here for our wedding. Learning of his death was devastating, both personally and practically." The Marshal made a note in his book before continuing. "How would you describe your relationship with Mr. Sullivan? Were you in love with him, or was this primarily a practical arrangement?" The question was more personal than Emma had expected, but she answered without hesitation. "It was a combination of both, I suppose. I had genuine affection for Mr. Sullivan based on our correspondence, and I believed that we could build a happy marriage together. But I was also motivated by practical considerations, as my circumstances in Philadelphia had become quite difficult after my father's death." Marshal Blackwood nodded, as if this answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "And when you arrived in Cedar Falls to find Mr. Sullivan dead, what were your immediate concerns?" Emma glanced briefly at James before answering. "I was devastated by the loss, of course, but I was also very worried about my practical situation. I'd used most of my resources to make the journey, and I had no family or connections in Colorado Territory. I was essentially stranded in a strange place with very limited options." "Which led you to accept accommodation at Mr. Mitchell's boarding house," the Marshal observed, his tone carefully neutral. "How did that arrangement come about?" James spoke for the first time since the interview began. "I saw Miss Thompson on the street, clearly distressed and looking for Mr. Sullivan's mercantile. When I realized who she was and what had happened, I offered her a room at my establishment. It seemed like the Christian thing to do under the circumstances." The Marshal's eyes moved between them with sharp intelligence. "And you are Mr. James Mitchell, the proprietor of the boarding house where Miss Thompson has been staying since her arrival. What was your relationship with Mr. Sullivan?" "We were acquaintances and occasional business associates," James replied carefully. "I would visit his mercantile for supplies for the boarding house, and we sometimes discussed local business matters. I respected him as a businessman and a member of the community." Marshal Blackwood made another note before asking his next question. "Did Mr. Sullivan ever mention Miss Thompson to you? Did he show you her photograph or discuss his upcoming marriage?" James felt his heart rate increase, recognizing that this was one of the questions he had been dreading. The truth was that Robert had indeed shown him Emma's photograph and had spoken of her frequently in the weeks leading up to her arrival, but admitting this could raise questions about the nature and timing of his own feelings for her. "Yes," James said finally, deciding that honesty was the safest approach. Robert was quite excited about Miss Thompson's arrival and spoke of her often. He had her photograph displayed in his rooms above the mercantile, and he showed it to me on several occasions. The marshal's eyebrows rose slightly at this admission. "And what was your reaction to seeing Miss Thompson's photograph?" The question struck at the heart of James's fears about the investigation. How could he explain that he had been attracted to Emma's image without making it sound as though he had been plotting to steal another man's bride? How could he convey the innocent nature of his initial interest while acknowledging that it had grown into something deeper? "I thought she was very beautiful," James said carefully, "and I was happy for Robert that he had found such an accomplished woman to share his life with. I never had any improper thoughts about her while she was intended for another man." Emma spoke up at this point, perhaps sensing James's discomfort. "Marshal, I should mention that Mr. Mitchell and I became engaged yesterday evening. We wanted to be transparent about our current relationship, even though it developed after Mr. Sullivan's death." The Marshal's expression became noticeably more alert at this information. "Engaged? That's quite a rapid development, considering that you arrived in town less than a week ago to marry another man." Emma's cheeks colored slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Yes, it has been rapid, but sometimes circumstances force us to make decisions quickly. Mr. Mitchell has been extraordinarily kind to me during a very difficult time, and we discovered that we have strong feelings for each other. Given my situation and the need to establish some stability in my life, we decided not to delay in formalizing our commitment." Marshal Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying both of them with calculating eyes. "Mr. Mitchell, when did you first realize that you had romantic feelings for Miss Thompson?" The question was the one James had been dreading most, and he knew that his answer could have serious implications for both of them. He took a deep breath and decided to trust in the truth, however complicated it might appear. "I began to develop feelings for her shortly after she arrived in Cedar Falls," he said. "Initially, I was simply concerned about her welfare and wanted to help her through a difficult situation. But as we spent time together and I got to know her character and personality, I realized that my feelings had become deeper than mere sympathy or friendship." The Marshal made extensive notes as James spoke, and his expression suggested that he was filing away every detail for later analysis. "And, Miss Thompson, when did you begin to return Mr. Mitchell's feelings?" Emma took a moment to consider her answer carefully. "I was initially focused on grieving for Mr. Sullivan and trying to understand my situation. But Mr. Mitchell's kindness and character became apparent very quickly, and I found myself developing genuine affection for him. It wasn't until recently that I realized those feelings had grown into love." "Recently," the Marshal repeated. "Could you be more specific about the timeline?" Emma glanced at James before answering. "We had an honest conversation about our feelings yesterday morning, and by evening we had decided to become engaged." Marshal Blackwood closed his notebook and leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "I have to say, the timing of these developments is quite remarkable. Miss Thompson, you arrived in Cedar Falls to marry a man who died in a suspicious fire just days before your arrival. You immediately took up residence with Mr. Mitchell, who admits to having seen your photograph and being impressed by your beauty. Within less than a week, you're engaged to marry him instead. You can understand why this sequence of events might raise questions." James felt a surge of anger at the Marshal's implications, but he forced himself to remain calm and professional. Marshal, I understand that the timing might seem unusual, but I can assure you that neither Miss Thompson nor I had anything to do with Robert Sullivan's death. The fire was a tragedy that affected the entire community, and we are simply two people who found comfort and love in the aftermath of that tragedy. Perhaps, Marshal Blackwood said non-committally, but I'll need to verify your whereabouts on the night of the fire, both of you, and I'll be interviewing other members of the community to get their perspectives on your relationship and the circumstances surrounding it. Emma spoke up with quiet dignity. Marshal, we welcome any investigation that will establish the truth. We have nothing to hide, and we're confident that anyone who knows us will attest to our character and the genuine nature of our feelings for each other. The Marshal nodded, but made no comment about whether he found their protestations convincing. Instead, he asked a series of detailed questions about their activities on the night of the fire, their financial situations, and their knowledge of Robert Sullivan's business affairs. The questions were thorough and sometimes uncomfortable, but both James and Emma answered them as completely and honestly as they could. As the interview drew to a close, Marshal Blackwood informed them that he would likely have additional questions as his investigation progressed, and that they should remain available in Cedar Falls until he had completed his work. The implication was clear. They were not formally under suspicion, but they were not free to leave town either. Walking back to the boarding house after the interview, James and Emma were both quiet, processing the experience and its implications. The Marshal's questions had been probing but not overtly hostile, yet there was no mistaking his suspicion about the timing and nature of their relationship. "Do you think he believes us?" Emma asked as they reached the boarding house porch. James considered the question carefully. "I think he's reserving judgment. He's clearly suspicious about the coincidences and timing, but I don't think he has any evidence of actual wrongdoing. The key will be whether other people in town support our version of events when he interviews them." Emma nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "I keep thinking about how this must look to him. A mail-order bride whose intended husband dies conveniently before she arrives, allowing her to marry a man who was already attracted to her. It sounds like something out of a dime novel." The observation was uncomfortably accurate, and James realized that they were facing a challenge that went beyond simply answering the Marshal's questions honestly. They needed to convince not just Marshal Blackwood, but potentially a broader legal system that their love story was genuine, rather than a cover for something more sinister. That evening, they received visits from several townspeople who had heard about their interview with the Marshal and wanted to offer support or gather information about the investigation's progress. Doc Peterson was reassuring, expressing confidence that anyone who knew them would vouch for their character. Reverend Carter stopped by to offer prayers for a swift resolution to the investigation and to remind them that the church community stood behind them. But there were also less encouraging visitors. Martha Wilson appeared at the boarding house door shortly after dinner, her expression radiating the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions were being validated by official attention. "I'm sure the Marshal found your story quite interesting," Martha said with false sweetness, "such a romantic tale of love blooming in the aftermath of tragedy. I do hope he was able to verify all the details to his satisfaction." Emma's response was measured but firm. The Marshal was very thorough in his questions, and we were happy to provide him with complete and honest answers. "We have nothing to hide and welcome any investigation that will establish the truth." Martha's smile was sharp. "Of course, dear. Though I'm sure you understand that some people in town have questions about the convenience of certain timing. Not everyone is as trusting as our good Reverend when it comes to matters of the heart." After Martha left, James found himself struggling with doubts that he hadn't felt before the Marshal's arrival. The federal investigation had cast their love story in a harsh light that made even genuine emotions seem calculated and suspicious. He began to wonder whether their hasty engagement had been the right decision, or whether it had simply provided more ammunition for those who wanted to question their motives. Emma seemed to sense his internal struggle. "Are you having second thoughts about our engagement?" she asked quietly as they sat together in the parlor after the last of their visitors had departed. James looked at her, taking in the intelligence and strength that had attracted him from the beginning, and felt his doubts dissolve. "No," he said firmly, "I'm having second thoughts about the timing of our announcement, but not about my desire to marry you. Whatever challenges this investigation brings, I want to face them with you as my partner." Emma's smile was the first genuinely happy expression he had seen from her since the marshal's arrival. "Then we'll get through this together. The truth is on our side, and love is stronger than suspicion or gossip." As they prepared to retire for the evening, both James and Emma knew that the coming days would test their relationship in ways they hadn't anticipated. The federal investigation would continue, bringing more questions and more scrutiny of their every action and motivation. The community would be watching to see how they handled the pressure, and their future in Cedar Falls might depend on their ability to convince skeptical observers that their love was genuine rather than convenient. But they also knew that they had found something real and valuable in each other, something worth fighting for, regardless of the obstacles that stood in their way. Whatever Marshal Blackwood's investigation might reveal about the fire that had killed Robert Sullivan, it could not diminish the truth of what James and Emma felt for each other. That truth would have to be enough to sustain them through whatever trials lay ahead. 3 weeks had passed since Marshal Blackwood's arrival, and Cedar Falls had settled into an uneasy rhythm of whispered conversations and furtive glances. The federal investigation had expanded beyond the initial interviews, with the marshal conducting follow-up conversations with dozens of townspeople and requesting documents from local businesses and government offices. The atmosphere of suspicion had begun to wear on everyone, transforming the once comfortable small-town dynamics into something strained and artificial. James had watched Emma navigate this period of scrutiny with remarkable grace, though he could see the toll it was taking on her. The woman who had arrived in Cedar Falls seeking a new beginning had instead found herself at the center of a federal investigation that questioned not only her motives, but her very character. Yet through it all, she had maintained her dignity and composure, answering questions with honesty and facing down gossip with quiet strength. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning, when Marshal Blackwood requested another meeting with James, this time alone. James had been expecting additional interrogation about his relationship with Emma or his knowledge of Robert Sullivan's business affairs. But the marshal's demeanor seemed different somehow, less adversarial and more professional, in the manner of someone preparing to share important information rather than extract it. "Mr. Mitchell," Marshal Blackwood began, settling into the chair across from James in the hotel dining room that had become his temporary office. "I want to discuss some developments in my investigation that I believe will be of considerable interest to you and Miss Thompson." James felt his heart rate quicken, uncertain whether the marshal's tone suggested good news or bad. "Of course, Marshal. I'm happy to help with whatever information you need." Marshal Blackwood opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents, arranging them on the table with the methodical precision that James had come to associate with the federal officer's approach to everything. "I've received the final report from the fire investigation experts who examined the remains of the Silver Dollar Saloon, along with some additional information from Denver that sheds new light on the circumstances surrounding Mr. Sullivan's death." The marshal paused, studying James's face as if gauging his reaction to what was about to be revealed. The fire was indeed deliberately set, Mr. Mitchell, but not by anyone in Cedar Falls, and certainly not by you or Miss Thompson. James felt a wave of relief, so powerful that it was almost disorienting. The fear that had been lurking beneath every conversation and every interaction for the past 3 weeks suddenly lifted, leaving him feeling lighter than he had since the investigation began. "Then you found the real arsonist?" Marshal Blackwood nodded grimly. "We have. A man named Theodore Garrison, who had been embezzling funds from several mining operations in the territory. Mr. Sullivan had apparently discovered evidence of Garrison's activities and was preparing to report him to federal authorities. Garrison set the fire to destroy financial records that were stored in the saloon's back office, where Sullivan and several other business leaders were conducting their weekly poker game. The revelation transformed everything James had understood about Robert Sullivan's death and the circumstances that had brought Emma into his life. What had appeared to be a tragic accident had actually been a calculated murder designed to cover up a larger crime. And Emma's arrival in Cedar Falls had simply been an unfortunate coincidence that had made her and James appear suspicious to outside observers. "Garrison has been arrested in Denver," Marshal Blackwood continued, "where he was attempting to board a train bound for California. He confessed to setting the fire when confronted with the evidence, though he claims he never intended for anyone to be killed. According to his statement, he thought the building would be empty at that hour and that he could destroy the records without harming anyone." James shook his head in amazement at the complexity of events that had led to such a simple misunderstanding. "So Emma and I were never actually suspects?" "Not formally," the marshal replied. "But I have to admit that the timing of Miss Thompson's arrival and your subsequent engagement raised questions that needed to be investigated thoroughly. In my experience, coincidences of that magnitude often turn out to be more than coincidental." Marshal Blackwood gathered his documents and returned them to his portfolio. His official business in Cedar Falls apparently concluded. "I'll be filing my final report with the territorial government, and I expect to be leaving town within the next few days. I want to thank you and Miss Thompson for your cooperation during this investigation, and I apologize if the process has been difficult for either of you." James stood as the marshal prepared to leave, extending his hand in a gesture of reconciliation that felt appropriate now that the cloud of suspicion had been lifted. "Thank you for being thorough, Marshal. I understand that you were simply doing your job, and I'm glad that the truth has finally come to light." After the marshal departed, James found himself standing alone in the hotel dining room, processing the magnitude of what he had just learned. The past 3 weeks of fear and uncertainty had been based on a misunderstanding, albeit one that was entirely reasonable given the circumstances. Emma's arrival in Cedar Falls had indeed been coincidental, and their love story was exactly what it appeared to be, rather than a cover for some elaborate criminal conspiracy. His first instinct was to find Emma immediately and share the news that would finally free them both from the shadow of suspicion that had been hanging over their relationship. He discovered her in the boarding house garden, tending to the small collection of herbs and vegetables that she had been cultivating as a way of contributing to the household while dealing with the stress of the investigation. "Emma," he called as he approached, unable to keep the excitement from his voice, "I have extraordinary news from Marshal Blackwood." She looked up from the tomato plants she had been staking, her face showing the cautious hope that had become her standard expression whenever the investigation was mentioned. "Has he finished his inquiry?" James took her hands in his, noting how much steadier they felt than they had during the weeks of uncertainty. "He has, and we've been completely cleared of any suspicion. The fire was set by a man named Theodore Garrison, who was trying to cover up his embezzlement activities. Robert discovered his crimes and was going to report him, so Garrison burned down the saloon to destroy the evidence. Emma's knees seemed to give way slightly, and James caught her around the waist, supporting her as the full impact of the news settled over her. "It's really over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're no longer under suspicion." "It's completely over," James confirmed, holding her close and feeling the tension drain from her body as she absorbed the news. Marshal Blackwood is preparing his final report and will be leaving town within a few days. Theodore Garrison has been arrested and has confessed to setting the fire. Emma was quiet for several moments, and James could see that she was struggling to process the emotional whiplash of moving from fear to relief so suddenly. The investigation had dominated their lives for weeks, coloring every interaction and decision, and its abrupt conclusion left them both feeling somewhat disoriented. "I almost can't believe it," Emma said finally. "I've been so afraid that something we said or did would be misinterpreted, that our love would be seen as evidence of guilt, rather than simply as what it is. And now you're telling me that none of it mattered, that we were never really in danger." James understood her confusion, having experienced the same mixture of relief and bewilderment when Marshal Blackwood had shared the news. "We were in danger in the sense that we could have been formally charged if the investigation had gone differently, but the real evidence was always on our side, and the truth was always going to come out eventually." They stood together in the garden, holding each other and watching the sun move across the mountains that surrounded Cedar Falls. The town looked the same as it always had, but James knew that everything had changed for them with the lifting of the shadow that had been hanging over their relationship. "What happens now?" Emma asked. "Now that we're free to make our own choices without worrying about how they'll be interpreted by federal marshals and suspicious townspeople?" James smiled at the question, realizing that they were finally free to focus on their future together, rather than defending their past. "Now we plan our wedding, settle into our life together, and build the partnership we've been dreaming about during all those carefully chaperoned conversations." Emma's laugh was the first truly carefree sound he had heard from her since the investigation began. A real wedding, with guests who were celebrating rather than watching for signs of guilt or impropriety. I can hardly imagine it. The announcement of the investigation's conclusion and their complete exoneration spread through Cedar Falls with the same speed that news of the marshal's arrival had traveled weeks earlier. But this time, the reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with townspeople expressing relief that the mystery had been solved and that 2 of their community members had been cleared of suspicion. Doc Peterson was among the first to offer congratulations, stopping by the boarding house with a bottle of wine and a broad smile. "I have to admit that I never seriously doubted your innocence," he said, "but I'm delighted that the official investigation has confirmed what those of us who know you have believed all along." Even Martha Wilson appeared at the boarding house. Udor, though her congratulations were somewhat more restrained and came with a note of defensiveness about her own role in questioning their relationship. "I hope you understand that my concerns were motivated by genuine worry about propriety rather than any personal animosity," she said, though her tone suggested that she was not entirely comfortable with having been proven wrong. Emma's response was gracious and diplomatic. "Of course, Mrs. Wilson. In such unusual circumstances, it was natural for people to have questions and concerns. I'm just grateful that the truth has been established and that we can all move forward." Reverend Carter visited that evening to discuss wedding plans, his manner considerably more relaxed now that he no longer had to navigate the delicate balance between supporting his parishioners and maintaining the moral authority of his position. The conversation about ceremony details and timing was pleasant and straightforward, unmarked by the careful qualifications and subtle warnings that had characterized their previous discussions. "I have to say," the Reverend admitted as they discussed potential dates, "that this has been one of the more unusual courtships I've had the privilege to oversee. But I've never doubted the sincerity of your feelings for each other, and I'm pleased that you'll finally be able to celebrate your union without any clouds hanging over the proceedings." As the days passed and Marshall Blackwood prepared for his departure from Cedar Falls, James and Emma found themselves rediscovering the easy companionship that had first drawn them together. Without the constant awareness of being watched and judged, their conversations became more natural and their interactions less guarded. The boarding house parlor, which had been the site of so many carefully chaperoned meetings, became once again a comfortable space where they could simply enjoy each other's company. The wedding was scheduled for the following month, giving them time to make proper arrangements and allowing the community to fully adjust to the new reality of their situation. Emma had received responses to her letters from Philadelphia, and while her relatives expressed surprise at the rapid developments, they also offered their support for her decision to remain in Cedar Falls and build a new life. James used the intervening weeks to make improvements to the boarding house that would accommodate Emma as his wife rather than simply as a guest. The small apartment behind the kitchen that served as his private quarters was expanded and refurnished, creating a proper home for them within the larger establishment. Emma threw herself into these domestic preparations with enthusiasm, finally able to plan for a future that felt secure and permanent. The transformation in their relationship was remarkable to observe. Where once they had been careful to maintain appropriate distance and formal address, they now moved together with the natural ease of a couple who had found their perfect complement. Their conversations ranged freely over topics both practical and philosophical, and James marveled daily at the intelligence and insight that Emma brought to every discussion. One evening, as they sat together on the boarding house porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Emma turned to James with a question that had clearly been on her mind. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Robert hadn't died? If I had arrived in Cedar Falls to find him alive and well, ready to proceed with our planned marriage?" James considered the question carefully, understanding that it touched on fundamental questions about fate, choice, and the paths that life takes. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "And I believe that you would have been a good wife to Robert, and that he would have been fortunate to have you. But I also believe that what we've found together is something special, something that might not have been possible under other circumstances." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I've come to believe that too. Not that Robert's death was somehow meant to happen, but that sometimes tragedy opens doors to possibilities we never would have imagined. If I had married Robert as planned, I would never have known what it felt like to find someone who truly understands me, someone with whom I can be completely myself." Their wedding day dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect mountain weather that seemed designed for celebration. The ceremony was held in the small church at the edge of town, with most of Cedar Falls in attendance. The community had rallied around the couple, perhaps motivated by relief that the mystery of the saloon fire had been solved and that two of their own had been vindicated, or perhaps simply by genuine affection for a love story that had triumphed over adversity. Emma wore a dress that she had sewn herself from fabric, purchased at the local mercantile, a creation that managed to be both elegant and practical in the way that had come to characterize her approach to frontier life. James wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion, and his face showed the joy of a man who had found exactly what he had been searching for without even realizing he was looking. As they exchanged vows in front of their friends and neighbors, James reflected on the extraordinary series of events that had brought them to this moment. Emma's journey from Philadelphia, Robert's tragic death, the federal investigation, and their own gradual discovery of love had all combined to create a story that no one could have predicted, but that felt inevitable in retrospect. The reception was held in the boarding house parlor and dining room, with tables laden with food contributed by the townspeople and decorations that transformed the familiar spaces into something festive and special. Doc Peterson offered a toast that summarized the feelings of many in attendance. To James and Emma, who have shown us that love can bloom even in the most challenging circumstances, and that truth and character will always prevail over suspicion and doubt. As the evening progressed and the guests began to disperse, James and Emma found themselves alone together for the first time as husband and wife. The boarding house settled into its familiar evening quiet around them, but everything felt different now that they were finally free to be together without reservation or concern for appearances. "Are you happy?" James asked as they stood together in their newly expanded apartment, looking around at the space that was now truly their home. Emma's answer came not in words, but in the way she moved into his arms, her face radiant with the joy of someone who had finally found her place in the world. "I'm more than happy," she said finally. "I'm home." Outside, Cedar Falls continued its eternal rhythm of work and rest, hope and disappointment, success and failure. But inside the boarding house, two people who had found each other against all odds were beginning the rest of their lives together, secure in the knowledge that their love was strong enough to weather whatever challenges the future might bring. The story of the mail-order bride who had come to marry one man and ended up with another would become part of Cedar Falls folklore, told and retold with embellishments and variations that would eventually transform it into something larger than the simple truth of two people finding love in unexpected circumstances. But for James and Emma, the reality was far more precious than any legend could ever be. They had found each other, claimed their happiness despite the obstacles in their path, and built a foundation for a future filled with love, partnership, and the deep satisfaction of a life lived authentically and well. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.